Okay, hello everybody. One question I get asked a lot is how do you use Anki for veterinary school? Previously, I have written a blog post on this topic, but I thought that a video might be more helpful to help show you where all of the buttons live and how to use them. So if you're not familiar, Anki or Anki, I'm not actually sure what the correct pronunciation is, but it's a flashcard app that is available for free on computers like Mac or PC. There are also apps available for the iPhone and for Android, but I think you have to pay like $20 or something for the iPhone version. The main features of Anki are that you can, one, make a ton of flashcards without having to carry around like 5 trees worth of paper, and two, it automatically calculates the ideal spaced repetition interval for each of the flashcards for you. Spaced repetition is basically this concept or calculation where it tries to estimate when you will have forgotten a piece of information, and it gives you back that card around the time it thinks that you would have forgotten it. So this is really helpful for studying, especially if you're keeping up with flashcards daily, because theoretically you should be mastering those topics by ongoing presentation around the time that you would have forgotten that topic. So if you have a fresh install of Anki, we're going to need to create some decks first. So creating a deck is quite easy. You just simply go down to the bottom here and you click Create a Deck, and then you can name it and click OK, and it will pop up in your list. There's also a button here for importing an Anki deck. So if you have a .apkg file, you can use that button to import it, and it will automatically put that deck into your collection. One other thing that I want to show you guys is that you can nest decks. So if I just make a new deck here called Test Deck, and say I wanted to put it in my veterinary anatomy course, I can just click and drag it and drop it into that course. And then when I open it up, I can see that it's down here at the bottom. This is a really useful tool because it means that you can make one kind of top level deck for all of your courses, and then you can have sub decks that can either be like the unit that you're working on or the lecture or things like that. Next, we should take a look at our deck settings, which we can do by clicking this little cog icon next to our deck and then clicking Options. So the first thing that I want to highlight here are the new cards per day. So these are fresh, never before seen cards that are within that deck. And because Anki is meant for spaced repetition over a long period of time, it's basically going to restrict how many new cards that it gives you each day to make sure that you're not looking at your entire deck on the very first day that you start studying. This next box here is the number of maximum reviews per day. So these are cards that you've already seen, and Anki has made some sort of judgment on how soon you should see it again. And so it'll give you only up to this amount of review cards each day. And very helpfully, newer versions of Anki actually give you a recommendation on how many maximum reviews you should set per day based on the number of new cards per day that you've set for your deck. For most of my veterinary training, I did around 50 new cards per day for each deck. However, that can really easily become overwhelming because, as you can see, it recommends about 10 times the amount of cards as reviews per day. So you also have to take that into account when you're thinking about how much time can I dedicate to Anki each day. Finally, the last thing that I want to highlight on this page is if we go down here to New Cards Insertion Order, we have the options of random or sequential. So this is either it'll give you a totally random new card that you haven't seen out of the deck, or you can set it to actually go in order of how you put the cards into the deck. So this can be really helpful. For example, if you're studying a lecture, if you put it into sequential order, you're actually going through the lecture and learning those cards in the order that they were presented or that information was presented to you in the first place. So that can be really nice, especially for really complex topics where you actually want to kind of be walked through the topic as you're learning and going through your flashcards. There's one final thing that you guys should know about decks that I think people kind of look over or they're not aware of, but if you have a top level deck and then you have a bunch of nested decks, as you can see, my top level deck here is only giving me 29 new cards, even though there are a lot more new cards if I went deck by deck in each of those nested decks. So what you have to do if you wanted to just say jump right in and just study all of veterinary anatomy, what you actually have to do is create a different type of deck. And so you can do that by clicking this little arrow next to the save button and going to add preset. And then I usually name this preset something like top level deck or top level or overall deck, something like that. And you set the new cards per day to the absolute maximum that you can, which is, I guess, 9999. And then you click save. And so now, and I go back to this deck, it's actually updated to as many cards as I can possibly do in that day based on how many cards there are in the nested decks. So if I click on this, even though it says 999 or 997 there, usually it will actually give you a lot more cards. It just has kind of a cap on how many numbers it can show in this particular area, so it usually maxes out around 1,000. But yeah, this is a nice way to be able to study all of your lectures or all of your decks that are all within one nested deck, and you can study them all at the same time without having to go back and click on something else. Okay, next we'll look at adding cards. So generally the way that I go in to add cards is I click on the deck I want to add them to, and then I click this add button up at the top, and then that automatically sets the deck for those cards up here. And we're going to look at basic cards to start, so I'm just going to change my note type by clicking on type there, and just go to basic. And these are just your typical like question on the front, answer on the back type of cards. And the one thing I want to highlight is the tags down here. So the tags are nice because it allows you to do even more organization at a much more granular level than even the decks allow you to. So one thing that I commonly do is I make a tag that is the course title or the course name. So this case, VMS 250 is our anatomy course. And then I might do like the unit. So for example, if we had a unit on musculoskeletal system, I would put that in as the next tag. And then I'm using these double colons because it makes a hierarchy, or like it nests those tags within each other. So what I'm doing here is I'm making one tag for VBMS 250. Underneath that tag, I have this unit called musculoskeletal. And now say I have a unit or a lecture that is on distal limb. So I would just add that and then use underscores instead of spaces. And now I have a specific lecture on distal limb that I can add cards to. So if I add in, for example, oh my goodness, my W key doesn't want to work right now, apparently. W. What is the lowest nerve block on the equine distal limb? I would put the PD block. And then I can hit add. And it'll leave the tag there because it's assuming that you want to add a bunch of stuff into that particular tag. And so now I have one new card in my test deck. The other thing that you can do that's really helpful is you can use this little pin icon here. And so if you click on it, what that does is if I put in a question, say like, I don't know why my W key is not working today. What are the clinical signs of polioencephalomalacia? Obviously not relevant to this deck, but that is what came to mind. I can put blah, blah, blah. I can add the card, and because I pinned it, it left it in place for the next card. So this means that I can go back and say, what are the clinical signs of Tizer's disease instead? And that would be saving me retyping all of the front part of this question. So that's kind of a handy tool to kind of expedite how quickly you can make flashcards. There are also some other card types that we can look at. So we can look at cloze deletions. If we click there and click choose. So what a cloze deletion is basically you give it a sentence and then you make it into a fill in the blank. So if I said, The trachea is lined by pseudocolumnar ciliated epithelium with goblet cells, and I wanted to make that into a flashcard. I might want to make a fill in the blank for kind of each of these common terms. And so what you do is you highlight the word that you want to make a fill in the blank, and then you click this little button here that says close deletion, and then you want to say new card. And there's also a hotkey there that you can use, and so you can make it much more efficient to make these types of cards. But you click that button, it does this fancy denotation of the first card, and then the second card, and then the third card here. And then when you click add, if you go back to your history and you click on this, you can see it's actually made 3 cards here. And if we preview them, they look like this. So now we've made a fill in the blank for that first close deletion, and we can fill it in. If we click on our next guy, we've now made a fill in the blank for the second word that we wanted. And yeah, you can keep going through them like that, and you can see how that would be really helpful for more complex topics where you actually just want to be able to fill in a blank and rather than trying to make a question from that information. All right, the next card type that we'll look at is image occlusion. So these ones, you actually don't need to change the card type. You can just put it on basic, but it'll give you this little button here that says add image occlusion. And if you click on that, you can go find a screenshot of something, for example. And it'll bring it up on this page, and you click the little rectangle button here, and you can draw blockers over the information that you want to turn into flashcards. And so once you have all of your kind of rectangles drawn, so it could be labels on a diagram or like steps in a flow chart or a table or something like that, then you want to either click hide all guess one or hide one guess one. And so what that means is hide all means all of these blocking rectangles will be present and it will just ask you to guess one of them. So you don't get any context clues from the other labels or other information that you see on the image. If you click hide one, guess one, that means that it's only going to block one piece of information and ask you to guess it. So you do have that context of where you are in the rest of the image. So depending on the type of image that you're trying to do an image occlusion on, you might want to do different things. So for example, this one here, we're labeling the layers of the intestine. I would probably do hide all guess one because then I'm challenging myself to make sure I actually know the terminology and I know which layer I'm looking at. Whereas if I was in a flow chart, if you just had a completely blocked flow chart, you wouldn't be able to actually tell what the preceding thing was and what's actually happening after the thing you're trying to guess. So that might be a use case for doing hide one, guess one. So for the sake of this demo, we'll just do hide all, guess one, and you can see it added 4 cards because there are 4 rectangles. And if I close this and go into this deck, we can see these image occlusion cards. And so what it's done is this kind of question mask will appear. So if I click preview, we can see it's asking us to guess what's behind this door number 1, if you will. And then when we click next, it reveals it. And same thing for the next one. So you can go through all of the different labels on a diagram or something like that using image occlusion. Okay, and then once you have your flashcards made, you can actually use this browse window that I've opened a couple times now to actually look at your flashcards. So you have your decks over here. You can pick which deck you want to look at. And then you also have your tags down here. So remember we did like VBMS 250, and then I said, oh, we'll make a musculoskeletal category. I can click that, and then there's kind of different layers of tags that you can get. And this is really helpful because, one, it helps organize your cards, but then the other thing that you can do is you can make a filtered deck. So this is probably one of the most commonly used study tools that Anki offers that I used. But basically, when you're trying to cram for an exam and you're not trying to do the regimented, very, sequential study method that Anki promotes, if you're trying to cram like most vet students or medical students are, doing a filtered deck can be really helpful. And so the way that that works is if you look up at the top of the browse window, there's this little kind of description of whatever you're looking at the moment. So if I change it, you can see that it changes, and I can choose whatever tag or whatever deck that I like, and I can do it as high up on the hierarchy as I want. So I could choose all of anatomy, I could choose one particular lecture, or I could choose one particular unit. So for the sake of this demo, we'll just do this unit tag. And what you want to do is you want to copy this information here, and then you go back to your main Anki and you go up to Tools and you click Create Filtered Deck. Oop, got too many windows open. And what you're going to do is you can change the filtered deck's name, so you can call it musculoskeletal. And then you're just going to paste whatever you had from your browse window into this search function. And then you can decide how many cards you want. So if you want to see every single card in that deck, you can hit like 99999. And then you can also decide how you want the cards to be presented to you. So a lot of the time when I'm studying, I will just do random because I want to see everything that that deck has to offer. But if I'm trying to learn a concept for the first time, I might do order added, because that again kind of walks you through the lecture step by step, making sure that you have some context of what's happening early in the lecture before you get into more complicated things. So we'll click that. And then you want to leave reschedule cards based on my answers checked, because that means that when it goes back to its original deck, it'll still retain the spaced repetition that you want if you're going to be studying this deck in the future. So then we'll click Build, and what that does is it creates this special deck that's got like kind of a blue color, or it's a different color than your normal decks. And when you click on it, you can read a little bit about it, but basically it's pulled every card based on the information that you gave it, and it's put it into this deck. So the nice thing about these decks is that you can get all of the cards that you want to study into one deck, and then as you do the cards, they actually go back to their home deck as you mark them easy. So if I click Study Now and say I knew this card really, really well, I hit Easy. If I actually go back, you can see that now my number of cards has dropped down to 7 when it was at 8 before. And that's because this card has returned back to its home deck, and I could filter it again and get it back if I wanted to. It's actually quite easy to do that. You can just go to Options and hit Rebuild, and it'll bring all of those cards back. You can see now I have 2 that are due because I'd already seen them. They're no longer new, but they are coming back to that filtered deck, and so I could cram or study all of these cards today if I wanted to, and I wouldn't have to wait for the spaced repetition that Anki enforces. So that's one strategy that you can use to kind of get through a lot of cards, especially if you're preparing for an exam or something like that. The last thing I wanted to talk about were strategies for studying using Anki. So I've alluded to the cramming, for example, and I've also alluded to using the sequential order to kind of work your way through a lecture the first time. And so generally the way that I would study is I would make my lecture slides, and I would do the hierarchical tagging down to the lecture level. And what I would do to start is I would go through each lecture on its own. So I would make a filtered deck for one lecture, and then go through it and make sure, putting it in sequential order, make sure that I understood all of the concepts that were going on in that lecture and could kind of start connecting the dots between different things that were discussed. Then, after that, once I felt comfortable with each lecture, I would then start studying all of my lectures together using the random feature. So I would then make a filtered deck for the unit, and I would put it on random and study through it as a unit to make sure that I could piece together all of the different aspects of all of the lectures in that unit, even though they were presented to me in a random way. Then finally, if I had time, I would go through all of the cards that were relevant to a particular exam using the random feature, so that I could go through the entire course or all of the content and make sure that I still had a good understanding of all the different bits and pieces, even though they were now randomized. So this does mean that I had to go through the flashcards a few different times, usually all in cramming mode using the filtered decks. but it just helped kind of organize the way that I was studying and make sure I wasn't getting confused because I didn't understand a pathway or how something linked to something else. The other thing that I wanted to mention is what makes a good flashcard. So I find students struggle a lot with making good flashcards, and I think the important thing is that each flashcard should really test only one fact or one piece of information. So if you have a fact that you want to learn, just make one flashcard for it, or maybe try to approach that fact from a couple of different directions. So if, for example, if it's a definition, you could make a card that is, what is inotropy, and then have the answer. And then you could say on another card, you could say, what term refers to X, and then you could have the answer on the back. So then you're getting both kind of directions of approaching the same piece of information. The other kind of thing that I see a lot of students do is that they make a lot of lists, or they'll have answers that are a lot of lists. It's really hard to remember a list. So, for example, if you had a card that was, what are the clinical signs of polioencephalomalacia, it might actually be better for your studying to actually make cards of, why does polioencephalomalacia cause ataxia? Or something like that, where you're actually having to link the information to something else. Because if you're just trying to rote memorize a list, it's going to be really easy for you to forget or to get confused with something else, and that can lead to mistakes or misunderstandings. And then finally, I think it's also helpful to look at how other people make flashcards, but always keep in mind that the way that your brain works, or the way that your brain learns best from a flashcard, that's the way that you should be building your flashcards. Anki is a very flexible tool, and it allows a lot of creativity and a lot of flexibility in how you approach making your flashcards. And so this can be very much a uniquely you thing. A lot of people will share flashcards, and I think that that's great as well. There's a lot to be learned from seeing how other people approach things. But ultimately, you have to do what's best for you, and so if that means editing decks or deleting cards that are becoming too onerous, that is definitely something that you should be doing. And remember that Anki is not going to be the best study tool for every type of thing. So if it's a complex physiologic pathway, Anki may not be the best way to understand that pathway, but it may be good for helping remind you of what you already learned about that pathway. So just be aware of its limitations and the fact that it does take a considerable amount of time to make flashcards and then do them. But the benefit of flashcards is that you are basically practicing what you would be doing on the exam, which is you're getting presented with a question and you have to come up with an answer. And so you're actually training your brain to come up with those answers just like you would be expected to do on the exam. So it is a really useful tool, and I think a lot of medical and veterinary students are very successful using flashcards as a study method. Well, that's all for me on Anki, I think. If you have any questions about it or you want some more clarification on particular topics within Anki, let me know. I've been using this program for many, many years now. I actually have over 200,000 flashcards, if you can believe it, between my undergrad, vet school, and then doing my residency program. So I have spent many hours with this program, and I understand it quite deeply. So if you do have any questions, let me know. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.